G'day ladies and gents, and welcome back to DCS World with Mags. So today we're going to be starting a new campaign playthrough. This campaign is called Over the Hump, and it features the MiG-29S. We'll be flying for the Russian forces in this particular campaign. And today's mission is the first mission of that campaign. This one's called Probe. This is effectively a Rattle the Saber mission. We're tasked with taking off and heading to a waypoint on the east end of the Hump. Now, the Hump is a mountain range that divides Russian and Georgian ground forces and is heavily guarded by an air defense network. Our job is to simply fly the length of the Hump, testing Georgian response times, SAM tracking and aircraft response times, but we're not allowed to cross the border into hostile territory. All going to plan, this should be just a nice joy flight around what will be the campaign area for the next few videos, and a great opportunity to talk about the MiG-29S, which happens to be one of my favourite modern Soviet-designed aircraft. So, let's talk a little bit about the history of the MiG-29. The MiG-29, NATO reporting name Fulcrum, was an aircraft that, well, to put it shortly, made the West collectively shit itself when it was discovered. To understand why, you need to bring yourself back to 1977. The Soviet Union was still operating and the Cold War was still in effect. This wouldn't change for another 14, almost 15 years. They were still very much a credible threat to NATO, although the writing was on the wall at this point. The economic troubles the superpower had been having were starting to become more and more visible to the outside world, and this was making the West very, very nervous. There's very few things more dangerous than somebody backed into a corner, and the Soviet Union was most certainly finding itself closer and closer to that corner. And while they were having major economic problems, they still had quite the arsenal of weapons available to them. Which of course brings us back to the air power of the time. Now, the US in the mid-1970s was feeling very secure, especially around 1977. In 1977, the F-15 Eagle had entered service just a year before in 1976. The F-16 had completed its trials and was going into full production and was due to enter service the following year in 1978. The production of the F-16 was also going to be NATO-wide. It was going to be sold, equipping all of the surrounding nations with an equivalent current Generation 4 aircraft, and an exceptionally good one at that. And while it was still in the final design process, the final prototype had not been put together and the test flights had not yet begun, the preliminary designs for the new FA-18 had been approved, and the basic fuselage for what would eventually become the test flight prototype was being assembled. These three new fighters represented the three most powerful combat aircraft that had ever been designed, and all of them were under the control of the United States and NATO. You can understand in this situation why the West would believe that they had total technological superiority at this point. And honestly, at this point, the Soviet Union had not presented anything to challenge that. The MiG-21 one of the most mass-produced fighters in the world, and an incredible aircraft for its time, was still the majority of the Soviet Air Forces at this point in terms of its fighter capability. This was an aircraft that was produced in 1956. Now, while the MiG-21 did make up the largest percentage of the Air Forces, of course it wasn't the most advanced design that was available to the Soviets. They did have a few others. From the MiG factories, we had the MiG-23 Flogger and the MiG-25 Foxbat. These massive slab-sided machines relied more on brute force than design, but they did demonstrate some of the most powerful fighter designs of the mid to late 1960s. Sukhoi also had the Su-15 on the table from 1965. Again, this aircraft was about a decade behind the times, but these were capable aircraft, just not capable to the level of these new machines being produced by the United States. And of course they shouldn't have been. It's worth re-mentioning here that all of these designs were at least a decade old, if not more, with the newest aircraft designed for air combat being, of course, the MiG-31. Now, this was extremely new at the time and extremely powerful, possibly the single most powerful interceptor ever developed. However, it did come with a few drawbacks. It was not suitable as a fighter. It was an interceptor designed to intercept high-altitude American jet bombers and destroy them before they could deploy nuclear payloads over Soviet territories, or to attempt to try and catch American high-speed recon aircraft such as the SR-71.
717, this is Control. You have reached the first recon location. Proceed to the second location and be careful not to stray into enemy airspace. Out.
And that is waypoint 1 reached, so at this point we turn ourselves west and make our way the length of the mountain range until we hit waypoint 2, and at that point we head back to the runway. But anyways, getting back to the story. So, painting the picture of the Soviet Union's air power at the time, all of their fighters were at least a decade old. The United States and NATO were producing a new generation of fighters, Generation 4. These fighters were completely above and beyond anything that the Soviets had demonstrated at this point. The MiG-31, the newest plane that they had available, was really only designed for interception, and if you look at its design closely, really has more in common with some of the older 60s designs. Just everything made larger, monstrous engines to get to altitude quickly, but nothing hyper advanced in terms of technology. Every other aircraft that had been produced in the Soviet Union within the last decade period was solely ground attackers or bombers. No new current generation fighters. And this is where NATO and the United States actually tripped themselves up at the time. They had come to believe the reason why no new fighter had been produced was that the Soviet Union was completely incapable of producing an aircraft to the equivalent of the newest generation of Allied or NATO aircraft. So with that picture in your head of what the United States and its Western allies thought of the Soviet Union at that moment in terms of its aircraft technology and development, you can imagine the absolute shock that rolled through the intelligence communities in November of 1977, when a satellite recon photo taken of a known test runway deep within Soviet territory caught sight of something unexpected. A new aircraft. A mere month after its first test flight, the West got its first look at the MiG-29. And they shat bricks. Now obviously this was just a satellite photo. You didn't have the test performance, you didn't have any video of it in flight, you didn't have any of the intelligence that would come later on. It was just one photograph, but it spoke so much. The design was completely modern, easily the equivalent of anything that the West was currently producing, and this was confirmed by the very designers of the aircraft that the West were now producing. This new aircraft was sleek, aerodynamic. There was nothing square or boxy in the design, there was nothing that screamed simplicity, as had been the case with many of Soviet Union's previous designs. More than that, there was an intent to the design itself. The cockpit itself being elevated above the height of the main fuselage of the aircraft, allowing the pilot much better visibility out the rear of the aircraft and forward. Soviet designers were known for being nothing if not practical, and the only reason to give that level of visibility to the pilot was if the pilot himself was going to need it in order to be able to engage in combat. He was going to be engaging at close range. Over the next few years, more and more information flooded in around the MiG-29, and most of this confirmed what the United States and its NATO allies had already assumed and proved their worst fears to be true. The information itself, as it turned out, was not particularly hard to come by, as it looked like the Soviet Union was actually looking to export this aircraft to other Warsaw Pact countries, and then eventually, further on, to anybody who would pay the money for them, but we'll get to that in a minute. The information that flooded in was an aircraft that was capable of an in excess of Mach 2 at altitude, could go well over Mach 1.2 at low altitudes, had a service ceiling in excess of 50,000 feet, and with its positive thrust-to-weight ratio could throw itself to maximum altitude in under a minute. Not only was the Soviet Union fully capable of producing a fourth-generation fighter, but they had in fact already done so, and they'd managed to take this new design all the way to the flight testing phase before they had any idea it had even been built. Now, if this had been earlier on in the Cold War, what the United States and its NATO allies would have been waiting for at this time would be either a MiG-29 to crash so that the wreckage could be taken and analysed, or for a Soviet pilot or a pilot of a Soviet-friendly nation that had access to this particular aircraft to defect to the West in order to get access to the airframe that way and be able to put it through its testing. But of course, this wasn't the early Cold War, this was at the end of the Cold War, which again makes the situation here rather different. As I mentioned earlier on, the Soviet Union was looking to sell this aircraft to its allies. Now, if you're going to sell an expensive piece of military hardware to somebody, it's usually paid to try and demonstrate it to them first. Now, should the Soviet Union have wished to only sell the aircraft to the Warsaw Pact-friendly nations, keeping such demonstrations quiet wouldn't have actually been an overly large issue for them. However, the rapidly degrading economic state of the Soviet Union at the time was actually forcing
Return to base. Out.
Soviet military hardware to be made available in ever-increasingly wider markets, and the MiG-29 was absolutely no exception. The MiG-29 made its first public debut at the International Air Show in Finland in 1986, just 4 years after it went into service with the Soviet Air Force. By 1989, the MiG-29 was being demonstrated in air shows all around the world, including air shows within NATO and Commonwealth countries. Of course, 1989 was also the year that the Berlin Wall fell, and not long after, in late 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. East and West Germany reformed, and with that reformation, the West got access to its first full flight line of MiG-29s. And at this point, the mysteries of the Fulcrum were completely open to the West. However, by this point, the aircraft had already done its work. The shock of discovering an aircraft that analysts at the time believed the Soviet Union was simply incapable of building was so profound that in 1981, 10 years before the fall of the Soviet Union, the US Air Force put in a requirement for a new generation of aircraft to replace the brand new Generation 4 fighters that they had just put into service. That requirement called for an advanced next-generation tactical fighter, an aircraft capable of remaining undetected while hunting and engaging multiple hostile fighters at once. That formal requirement, triggered by the discovery of the MiG-29, would eventually develop into the aircraft we know today as the F-22 Raptor, the first of the Generation 5 fighters. So, with our mission complete, we are now on our way back to the runway to land, and this means we are in the final section of this video. Now, everything I've spoken to about now has been largely about the shock discovery of this aircraft and the fact that it existed at all, the self-confidence of NATO and its allies that this aircraft could never have actually been built in the first place. But what about the actual machine? Well, it has its problems. The MiG-29 is a beautiful aircraft, and it is an incredibly capable dogfighter, especially once you consider in its weapons targeting systems. The Fulcrum features a head-mounted targeting system, which allows the pilot to simply look at a hostile target, lock and engage with R-73 Archer missiles, without actually having to point the aircraft at the target in order to achieve that lock. The airframe itself can take over 9G, and with a capable pilot that is experienced, it is capable of outmaneuvering almost any fighter that it faces. It is an incredibly good dogfighter, but that doesn't make it a perfect aircraft. I'm sure you've noticed inside of the cockpit how most of the aircraft is switches and gauges, with only one MFD on the top right-hand corner, and a relatively limited amount of information seemingly to come into the pilot. This is quite correct. The MiG-29 actually doesn't feed a lot of complex information to the pilot. The pilot is entirely reliant on information from outside of the aircraft in order to perform, such as reporting from AWACS aircraft, or at the very least reporting from other aircraft within its own flight. Also, the radar system on it is relatively basic, not having a huge amount of options, limiting again the information that the pilot has available. And the last major limitation, of course, is the range. The MiG-29 doesn't actually have a massive range on its own internal tanks. Maximum range on internal fuel stores only is around 1,400 kilometers. With external tanks bolted on, the aircraft could extend that out to just over 2,100 kilometers, but this is still extremely short. To put this into perspective for you, the F-16 with external tanks can exceed 4,000 kilometers range, and the F-15 can exceed 5,000 kilometers range. To put the MiG-29 on a runway where it could operate effectively within the limited fuel range it has available to itself, assuming combat speeds, it has to be based on a runway extremely close to what would be the front line of operations for the forces it's trying to engage. A range that makes both the aircraft and the runways that it's operating off extremely vulnerable to hostile fast strike bombers. So in the end, the MiG-29 is an incredibly beautiful aircraft, but one that has its vulnerabilities. But it's still a plane that I enjoy flying, especially in DCS, and I'm looking forward to playing this campaign. Anyways, ladies and gents, we're going to bring this one to a close as we begin our final approach for landing. At this point, my intention is to do a video on the campaign at least once a week. I'm going to try and do 2 this week, so there should be another one in the next couple of days. I'm not expecting this campaign to be particularly long, so there will probably only be a couple of missions in it. However, once it's completed, we may move on to another one. I may even put a little bit of a call out to you guys on which aircraft you would like to see flown out next for a campaign. Anyways, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to leave a comment in the comment section down below and click that like button. And until next time, fly smart, fly safe, and I'll catch you in the skies.